Happy Good Friday, everybody. Well, I guess it's not really a happy Good Friday because, I hope you guys are having a good day anyway. And, it being the Easter season, I wanted to talk about the show that actually gives me hope for the future of Christian films. The Chosen, Season 1. That's right, this video is only going to be focusing on Season 1 of The Chosen. Yes, I have seen Season 2 and it's good, but that'll be for its own video whenever I get around to doing that. But I want to talk about Season 1 because since it's the Easter season, I wanted to do something biblical. But The Chosen is such a great example of how to do epic biblical narratives in a way that feels grounded and relatable and real. And it's something that I've been waiting for Christian filmmakers to do because there is so much drama and interpersonal relationships and just great storytelling in the Bible that can make for really awesome movies. The problem is, like I said in my Samson video, that either they're made by Hollywood, by directors and producers that don't read the Bible, they don't understand the story, and so they change a bunch of stuff and they completely miss the point at the end of the day. Or they're made by Christian filmmakers that, for one, either don't have the budget to pull off that epic period scope, and two, they try to clean up the Bible too much. They try to make every good person in the Bible perfect, and the only perfect one in the Bible is Jesus, and everybody else has sinned in some pretty big and noteworthy ways. David. But that also kind of misses the point because the Bible is the story of broken people, sinful people, that God ultimately uses to fulfill his plan. But then here comes Dallas Jenkins in 2019 dropping this show, The Chosen, which was entirely crowdfunded and broke records doing so, and the production value that they were able to get away with on this show is impressive. It looks good. It looks like a Hollywood produced film. But that's all surface level stuff. What I really want to get at is why does The Chosen succeed and resonate with so many people, so much so that they are still raising money for their fourth season. They already have season 3 entirely funded at the time of this recording. We're just waiting for them to finish and release it. And people are already donating to fund season 4. Well, I think it has a lot to do with the story that Dallas Jenkins is telling with this show. And basically, it's the same story that we've seen done dozens of times by dozens of filmmakers, and it's the story of the life of Jesus and his ministry. But what sets The Chosen apart primarily is that it's a series and not just a movie, so you don't have to cram the years of Jesus' ministry, Jesus' death and resurrection and ministry after the resurrection into a 3-hour max window. That just can't be done and really hasn't been done that well. It's been done, good enough a couple times, but there was never a Jesus movie that made me think, wow, that's really the story that's in the Bible, man. They got it all. That is the definitive version. There really isn't one. And before The Chosen came along, the only depiction of Jesus on film that I had any kind of emotional connection to was Jim Caviezel in Passion of the Christ. And that's just because you see this guy go through the ringer in this movie, and it's hard to watch at times. But, there's still that empathy, there's that emotional connection. With a lot of the other Jesuses on screen, you don't really get that because there just isn't enough time to really flesh him out and see what he's all about. They also tend not to write him that well because he is so perfect that he just comes across as like stiff and detached from everybody else. But I'm getting ahead of myself because this show, The Chosen, isn't even really about Jesus. It's really the story of the disciples, and season 1 focuses on 3 of them. It's Mary Magdalene, it's Matthew, and it's Simon. And also Andrew, Simon's brother. They're kind of a package deal. But it's really those 3. And that's what I like about this show, is that it spends a lot of time and we get to know the disciples, because every other Jesus movie out there, the disciples are all just kind of the same bearded guys. Maybe you'll get a scene with Peter, cutting a dude's ear off. But really, they're all just interchangeable. They're just this herd of bearded guys that follow Jesus around. But in this show, they do such a good job at giving them distinct personalities. And I'm going to start with Simon, because Simon, played by Sahar Isaac, is my favorite character in the show. They did him so right. And that's because Simon, as depicted in this series, is kind of the least likely to join Jesus's entourage. Simon is just so beaten down by the world and Roman oppression, that he has just kind of given up on his faith, given up on waiting for the Messiah to come, and he just needs to provide for his wife. You know, he's just got to make a living and survive, because him and his brother are behind on taxes. They're not great fishermen. They make enough to kind of get by, but the taxes are starting to pile up. He's a gambler, he drinks. He's not the most upstanding guy, and the show takes its time to depict this so that we can understand where Simon's coming from. And even though we see him lie and cheat and betray his own people, you know, selling out Jewish merchant fishermen to the Romans so that he can get a free pass on taxes, that's not a good guy. But Sahar Isaac does such a great job portraying this character and giving him such likability and charm and charisma that he's got that kind of likable anti-hero, you know, that Han Solo energy. And what I appreciate more than just showing his background and his backstory and where he's coming from and the damage that he has inside, you know, that shows that he needs someone like Jesus to help him and guide him and teach him, is that even after he agrees to follow Jesus and that he's seen miracles and his faith is restored, he doesn't just become the most righteous, upstanding guy you've ever met. His personality and negative tendencies are still very much intact, so it's not like they just go away. This is something that he, throughout the show, needs to work on and gets called out for and makes mistakes, and then Jesus or somebody else will correct him and show him a different point of view. And you actually see growth and character development and the things that make great storytelling. And it seems basic, but you'd be surprised how many Christian films are out there that totally messed this up. But it's not just Simon that gets this treatment. Matthew, played by Perez Patel, also has his own arc that he goes on, and is really one of the biggest surprises to me in this show is how good this characterization of Matthew is. I don't think it's perfect, and I do think there are some things that if I were in charge, I would have done differently. But for what we got, it is still heads and shoulders above any other theatrical or even made-for-TV depiction of Matthew that we've gotten. And for those of you who don't know, Matthew is a tax collector, and this is a guy that makes a living taking money from his fellow Jews to then give it to the state, the Roman government. And that doesn't make him a very popular guy. In fact, he is ostracized by his own family and practically every Jew in Capernaum, because obviously nobody likes the tax man. And also tax collectors were notorious for taking a little bit of a bigger cut for themselves than was necessary. So yeah, not only were you being screwed by the Romans, you were being screwed by this guy taking more of your money than he needs to, but oh well. And even if you were by chance an honest tax collector, they're still not going to believe you. And that's the predicament that we see Matthew in. Matthew, tax collector, the nicest house in the street. He's got the fanciest clothes and thinks pretty highly of himself. You know, he respects himself and he tries to do a good job. The show kind of makes it seem like he has autism, or at least is on the spectrum. And I think that's an interesting way to go with Matthew, because Matthew, as a tax collector, you know, he'd have to be very numbers oriented. You know, he's got to be very concrete and logical, but also not great in social interactions, which makes him feel even more ostracized from the Jewish community. But the downside to that is that Matthew seems very innocent in all of this. That despite what the reputation of tax collectors would suggest, Matthew clearly is not taking more money than he needs. He's not ripping off his own people. He's a morally upstanding guy. You know, he wouldn't cheat anybody. And while that's not a bad thing, for me personally, I wish that we saw a version of Matthew that was conniving, that was avaricious, you know, that would rip off his own people, that was a little corrupt. Again, kind of going back to what they did with Simon, that Simon wasn't a great guy, but, you know, he could still learn and improve. I would have liked to see that with Matthew, and the fact that Matthew actually ripped off his future disciples, and there's more conflict there, and there's more tension. And while there is still tension with him just being a tax collector, and as the show plays out, you do see some sparks start to fly, especially between Matthew and Simon, I can't help but imagine how much more tense and awkward and frustrating the situation would be if Matthew was an actual corrupt tax collector. So that when he does decide to follow Jesus, he learns humility and morality, and you just see more of a tangible change in his personality and character by the end of this show. I think that was kind of a missed opportunity, but I still appreciate that Matthew actually became a three-dimensional character in his own right in this show. So that's still good. But moving right along, let's talk about Mary Magdalene. Now this is a character that, like Matthew, is heads and shoulders above every other depiction that I've seen, but still there is room for improvement. I think there are some ways that they could have pushed it to just make it a little more complete a picture of who Mary Magdalene was. But as for what they did well, on the first episode, we spent a lot of time with Mary Magdalene, and we see that she's a prostitute and that she's demon-possessed. And those two phrases alone, that she's a prostitute and that she's demon-possessed, and that ultimately this broken person will become one of the firmest believers in Jesus going forward, that is ripe with storytelling possibilities. And this show really digs into one of them. Hey, this is Colby jumping right back in here from the editing stage real quick. So it turns out, after doing some research, that the matter of Mary Magdalene being a prostitute is still very much up for debate, if not completely debunked. I'm still not entirely sure on what the consensus is on that. Again, I'm not a theologian, and I'm not really willing to make a strong theological stance in this video. It's not the point of the video. But giving this new information, I do understand why Dallas Jenkins didn't include this angle of Mary's life, or at least reference it explicitly. But regardless, it seems like Dallas Jenkins is willing to develop backstories and even fabricate backstories to disciples that aren't developed and given backstories in the biblical text. So I still think what I have to say in this video is valid, because they could have still developed her into being a former prostitute and have that play into the narrative a little bit more. Alright, now back to the video. But to the show's credit, it does a really good job at exploring the demon possession side of Mary's life. Because here she is, she's in the red quarter, I guess that's like the prostitution wing. She's among all these other prostitutes, she's not having a good life, these demon fits keep getting worse. She blacks out, she doesn't really remember what happens, and she hurts people. For instance, there was a client that she was sleeping with, and she cut him and attacked him, and she doesn't really remember it, but the guy comes out all bloodied and gross, and I'm like, okay, yeah, you know, you're possessed by demons, like, stuff like that's gonna happen, and you are gonna get a reputation as not being the most reliable prostitute. And we see Mary going to bars and trying to like drown out the demons with some kind of, I assume, alcoholic concoction. And similar to Matthew, this isolates her. You know, she's getting depression, she's contemplating suicide, and Elizabeth Tavish gives a great performance as Mary. You believe every second of this. You believe the torment. And after she's relieved of these demons by Jesus, you see her completely turned around. She's happy, she's smiling, she's getting back into the Jewish practices. You know, she stopped being a prostitute, and you see a completely different life here than she had before. And the only reason why you believe the happiness at the end is because you bought into the tragedy and helplessness in the beginning. But the only downside of focusing so much on the demon possession angle of Mary's pre-Christ life is that the prostitute side kind of gets swept under the rug a bit. You know, she was a prostitute, and she did that for a long time. And the show is kind of vague how much of it was the demons making her do it and how much of it was on her own accord, but the show doesn't really explain it at all. There's no scene after she's healed of the demons where she makes the conscious choice to leave that life of prostitution behind. She's just kind of rid of it the next time we see her. So that would have been nice. And I can't help but think how great it would be from a dramatic standpoint is after she joins the disciples, one or more of them recognize her as a prostitute that they've slept with. Because again, Jesus isn't exactly picking the most holy men to follow him. You know, he's picking tax collectors and prostitutes and liars and cheaters, and the beauty of this story is seeing those people learn and become better. So it just would have been nice to see that kind of come back around where one of the disciples is like, oh yeah, I slept with her, she was a prostitute, and maybe he tries to accuse her and be kind of holier than thou, and then she comes back at him and there's this back and forth, and maybe Jesus has to step in and kind of set the record straight. I don't know, I'm just coming up with these ideas, but I can't help but think that if the life of prostitution kind of followed her into her new life, the way Matthew's past life and Simon's past life kind of followed them into their new life, I just think that would have been more dramatic and more relatable and just lead to some really good conversations amongst the disciples. But before I talk about the big guy, Jesus, you know, the guy I'm sure all of you want to know my thoughts on, I have to give an honorable mention to Eric Avari as Nicodemus. His storyline in this show is amazing because he's a Pharisee. He's the stereotypical enemy of Jesus. If you read the Gospels, it's almost nothing but the Pharisees and Jesus button heads. And here's Nicodemus, a Pharisee that has his own crisis of faith and starts questioning the law and questioning the old ways and is pursuing Jesus and this new way of thinking. And he kind of gets his questions answered, but mostly just bring up more questions that he doesn't understand, but he wants to understand and you believe it. And Eric Avari gives a great performance as Nicodemus, probably the best performance in the show, period, because he is juggling so much. He's juggling the status and wealth that he's accumulated as a Pharisee, but also the humility of knowing that there's so much of the Almighty that we don't understand, and also the pressure from his wife, and she just wants stability and predictability and calm and peace. And here Nicodemus is swept up in all this controversy surrounding Jesus, and he doesn't really know what to think, and he's just caught in the middle of all of this. And it's heartbreaking at the end of this season when he doesn't take Jesus' invitation to follow him as one of his disciples, but you can tell that he really wanted to, but he just couldn't give up that life of being a Pharisee. So yeah, Nicodemus in the show, awesome. They got a great actor to play him. But now it's time to really talk about Jesus. And Jonathan Rumi plays Jesus in the show, and it's so refreshing to see a Jesus in a movie that actually looks Jewish and not like a Anglo-Saxon white guy with a beard. He's great in this show, and it goes beyond just the more realistic physical appearance. What makes this version of Jesus work so well is the humanity that he brings to Jesus. Jesus actually has fun and laughs and parties at a wedding with his disciples and drinks wine and, is a people person. He cracks jokes, he can be sarcastic, he's just so much more like a real person, even though the show doesn't compromise on Jesus' perfection. He doesn't lie, he doesn't sin. He's still the ideal human being, just, with a little more fun and personality than we usually get in Jesus' stories. And this characterization of Jesus is emblematic of really the whole show and why this show has garnered such a following and has gotten so much funding just from people like us. Because unlike a lot of Christian media out there, they didn't forget about the humanity in these characters and making them actually three-dimensional and not just archetypal heroes that we look up to and idolize and appreciate but can never relate to. These characters in The Chosen, be it Nicodemus or Matthew or Simon or even Jesus himself, we can all relate to them because they talk and respond and have conversations that normal people would have. It doesn't feel like verses in scripture just being regurgitated. It feels like real one-on-one conversation, even though a lot of the dialogue is verbatim scripture. It's performed and rewritten in a way that feels more natural. And this is why I want to talk about the show, because even though I do think it could have gone a little further in some places, maybe bring up the prostitution angle a bit more, or maybe make Matthew less innocent, more corrupted. At the end of the day, this is still such a leap forward in quality in Christian entertainment that we've gotten in the past, 10 to 20 years. And I'm so glad that Dallas Jenkins took this on, because here's a guy that understands good filmmaking and he understands storytelling and emotion, and he's done a phenomenal job with this show. Can't wait to talk about season 2. Can't wait for season 3 to drop so I can watch that. And if you haven't seen The Chosen yet and you're like me and was just like, I'm gonna give it a pass, it's just another Jesus show, you've seen one, you see them all, and they're usually not that memorable, watch the first episode, because you'll be convinced that this show is doing something different. It's taking the Bible seriously while also taking the filmmaking and storytelling seriously, and that's just not something that we get very often. But I'll turn it over to you guys. What do you think about The Chosen? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.